Hello, everybody. Thank you, everyone here tonight. Tonight, we'll take a look at the life of America's favorite troubled soul, Edgar Allan Poe. His birthday on this day, January 19th, making him 213 years old. The 19th century poet, fiction writer, editor, and literary critic is best known for his tales on horrifying mysteries and was one of the earliest American writers of the short stories. The program will be directed by Eva Garida. Eva Garida, an independent Poe scholar, holds a master's degree in 19th century American literature from Rutgers University. She is the editor of the New Crier, official newsletter of the Historical Society of Bloomfield, New Jersey, a contributing book review for the Edgar Allan Poe Review from Penn State University. She is a recipient of the Kevin M. Hale Publication Award and the Emily Greenaway Creative Writing Award. It is my honor to introduce Eva Garida.
Thank you, Jose. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out. What a good-looking crowd. I also won another award recently from the West Caldwell Library, but I can't remember the name of it, so I didn't even put it on. But the Emily Greenaway one was actually in college, so I know all my college friends here are having a laugh because that was like a really long time ago. So can we mute everybody, Jose?
If you want to, yes, you can.
Yeah, let's mute them till the end. Thank you. So let's get started. I'm just, hey, Nick. I can't get rid of this bar. Got it. Okay. So thanks again for coming, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Let's get started. So Edgar Allan Poe, born on this date in 1809. As Anne asked, I can't believe he's only 40 years old. People did not live very long at that time. Actually, 40 is a pretty good age for that time period. The United States was in its infancy, and it was a very, very difficult existence. If you lived to 40, that was pretty good. Okay. I'm getting a lot of text, Jose, that people didn't get the link, so I don't know what to do at this point, so we'll just move on.
Okay.
So the biggest thing to understanding Edgar Allan Poe, the biggest barrier to understanding Edgar Allan Poe is our cultural perceptions, which in our collective consciousness, we've gone from this is how we see him now. Poe as a madman, Poe as a debauched, drug-addled wife beater. And this is very far from the truth. He was far from demented. He was extremely learned, extremely hardworking individual, and extremely talented. So what makes us think of him in this way? Well, it could be Vincent Price. When I was a kid, I would come home from school and every day I'd watch the 4:30 movie, and there would be a theme every week, and it would be Gidget Week, or it would be Planet of the Apes Week, and there would be Vincent Price Week. And Vincent Price was never presented, or they never showed movies of Vincent Price in his youth when he was really young and dashing. It was always these movies, The Raven, Fall of the House of Usher, Mask of the Red Death. This is a lobby card from the Mask of the Red Death that my sister gave me for Christmas several years ago, and it's framed and in my book room. So what happened was in the early 60s, American International Pictures joined forces with Vincent Price and the filmmaker Roger Corman. They wanted to do a series of horror movies based on Edgar Allan Poe. They were very lavish, kind of cheap budget, but very, very colorful and lavish and ghoulish. And they had nothing whatsoever to do with Poe's short stories. They merely took the title and ran somewhere else with it. So some of the movies you might remember are The Raven, Pit and the Pendulum, Fall of the House of Usher, Mask of the Red Death, Premature Burial, Haunted Palace, and Tomb of Ligeia. These were very popular, and but really had nothing to do with Poe at all. Another reason we think of Poe as a madman is this gentleman, in addition to Roger Corman on our left, is this gentleman on the right. And his name is Rufus Griswold. And we'll talk about him at length later, but these two, Roger Corman and Rufus Griswold, together painted a very unsavory picture of Poe. So we went from this to this. So here we have a very erudite, learned man, hardworking, brilliant, really, to this. So how did we get there? We'll start at the beginning. This is Poe's mother, Eliza Poe. Her full name is Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins Poe. She was born in the spring of 1787. Nobody knows when, just the spring, in London. When she was 2 years old, her father died. Her mother was an actress. And when she was 8, she and her mother immigrated to Boston from London. They left in November of 1795 and got to Boston in January of 1796. So that's 2 full months on a ship in the winter crossing the Atlantic. It would have been brutal. 3 months after they landed in Boston, her mother married a man named Charles Tubbs, who was a musician who was on the boat with them coming over from England. It's unclear whether they met on the boat or if they met in England and decided to come over together. It's unclear. So he's a musician. Elizabeth, who is Eliza's mother, is an actress, and they form a theatrical troupe. And their manager is called Mr. Edgar. And they travel up and down the East Coast, putting on performances and putting on plays from the Carolinas all the way up to New England. And they try to make it so that they were in New England in the summer and down south in the winter. Didn't always work out that way. Sometimes they had to spend their winters in what's now Maine, which was a pretty bleak. Eliza Poe started as an actress at the age of 9 and got very, very good reviews. She was a born actress and would go on to play over 300 roles, including a lot of Shakespeare. So she must have been literate, because I don't think you can memorize that. But there's nothing to say she was literate or not literate, but she probably could read. Her mother died when she was 11, somewhere in the Carolinas. And what does an 11-year-old foreign-born orphan do in the United States? There's no real orphan. There are orphanages, but not a lot. And they're not pleasant places. So she just kept on acting with the troupe. They became her family. And she just kept on going and getting great reviews. She was said to have a melodious voice and a very interesting figure. And at the age of 15, she married a man named Charles Hopkins. Widowed at 18, Mr. Hopkins dies. And 6 months later, when she's still 18, she marries a man named David Poe Jr., and he's 21. David Poe Jr. saw her acting in, I believe it was Norfolk, Virginia, or Richmond, Virginia, and decided to quit law school and become an actor himself, quite literally running away to join the acting troupe, which, by the way, being an actor in this time period is one step up from living on the street. It is not a well thought of profession. Many cities still have theaters outlawed because they're seen as a very racy, not honorable profession. That's starting to change at this time. More cities are relenting and letting and opening theaters. But anyway, so she marries David Poe Jr. He becomes an actor. Her reviews are great. His reviews are not great. He is not a very good actor. So they continue and they land in Boston for a while, and where she gives birth to her first son, which is William Poe in January of 17, and Edgar Poe is born in January of 1819. It's believed he was named after their manager, Mr. Edgar. We don't really know, but it's possible. So Edgar's born in January of 1819. His mother worked until 10 days before his birth, because if you don't work, you don't get paid. In the summer of 1819, they're in New York City, and David Poe's had enough, and he runs off and leaves the family. Edgar's sister Rosalie is born in December of 1810. So if you do the math, if your dad runs off in the summer of 1807 and you're born in December of 1810, that's probably actually not your dad. So she was given the name Poe, but that is not her father. Her father is thought to be another actor. Oops, another actor, John Howard Payne, or a man named Joseph Gallego, who left his sister Rosalie $2,000 in his will for reasons we don't know. Sorry, let me backtrack a little, my bad. Here's a nice book about Eliza Poe. If you're really that interested, it's 1988. It was only printed once. Not hard to find. There's a lot on eBay. I certainly have my copy. Here's just talking about Boston, where Edgar and his brother were born. This is a statue of Edgar Poe that was put up in Boston in 2014. Not my favorite. It's not what I would consider a subtle statue. If you look, he's holding a briefcase and with a giant raven popping out of the front of the briefcase, and in the back is all his papers are spilling out of the briefcase, and on top of those papers is an anatomically correct heart, to, I would imagine, allude to the Telltale Heart, one of his most famous stories, but again, not my favorite. Sorry, so here's his sister Rosalie as she appeared in middle age, and his half sister, because even though her name is Poe, dad wasn't around. So Rosalie's born in 1810. Eliza dies in 1811. She's buried in St. John's Episcopal Church graveyard in Richmond, Virginia. And this is just an approximate placing of the stone that was put up many years later. They don't really know where she's buried in the churchyard, because again, having a headstone meant you had money. And these people certainly had no money for things like that. So she dies on December 8th of 1811. And it is believed her estranged husband, David Poe Jr., died about 3 days later on December 11th in Norfolk, Virginia. Not really sure about that, but they believe that's what's up with him. So Edgar, William, and his brother William and his sister Rosalie, they too now are orphans. Edgar is 3, Rosalie is 1, William is 4, almost 5. So where do they go? What do you do with orphans? William was sent to his paternal grandparents in Baltimore. So that's David Poe Sr. and his wife Elizabeth, and his Aunt Mariah, who is David Poe Jr.'s sister, only living sibling. Edgar Poe goes with a foster family called John and Frances Allen, He stays in Richmond. And Rosalie Poe also stays in Richmond, but she goes to a family called Mackenzie. Now, these are foster parents only. Rosalie and Edgar are never adopted. And that's significant. That's really important because these families are very well-to-do. And when you adopt a child, they're now your heir. And when you're talking about fortunes and land and property, you do not give those away to orphans. You know, you keep that in the family. So they would not have been adopted. Despite what you see on the movies and Little House on the Prairie, adoption was very, very rare. So Rosalie was thought to be very slow. She was very slow, mentally slow, had some type of developmental disability. And when Eliza, their mother, was very sick and was dying, there was a nurse taking care of the children. The nurse admitted to giving the children bread soaked in gin and other liquor, as well as laudanum, which was a over-the-counter medicine at the time, but was liquid opium. So she's giving the children liquor and opium, and the theory is that Rosalie could have been mentally stunted by having that being under the age of 1. So Rosalie does not even know she has siblings until she's much older, you know, an older child, which is weird because she and Edgar lived in the same city and were fostered by wealthy parents. So they are now orphans and in their respective homes. This is John and Frances Allan. These are Edgar's foster parents. And that's where the Allan in his name comes from, in tribute to them. Frances had to beg her husband to foster Edgar. He didn't want the child. Nobody really wants street urchins and children of actors in their house, but she begged and begged for him because she could not have children of her own. So Frances is childless. John is not childless. John has illegitimate children all over Richmond, and Frances knows this. So she just wants something of her own to love. And she convinces him to take Edgar. But John and Edgar never get along from the time that he's a small child. They don't get along, just incompatible. He considers Edgar a dreamer. Edgar idolizes Lord Byron and the Romantic poets, and to a man of business like John Allan, that's, you know, a big waste of time. So John Allan's fortune comes from the, you know, what's described as the sugar trade, but what we know now is actually that vicious triangle that goes from Africa to the Caribbean to the American South. You know, sugar, rum, slaves, cotton, rum, sugar, slaves. So yes, he made a lot of money in the slave trade, as well as, you know, shipping other things. Nobody just shipped slaves. It was just what came from Africa, and then you would send the ship somewhere else with something else. So they live in England from 1815 to 1820. So from the age Edgar is 6 to 11, he gets a British education, and the Allans moved there for business. They moved back in 1820, and John Allan inherits $750,000, which is a hell of a lot of money now. But in 1820, that is $21 million in 2022 dollars. So it is massive fortune, massive. This is Poe's first love, Sarah Elmira Royster, although he called her Elmira. They fell in love when she was 15 and he was 16. Her father, they were secretly engaged, and her father absolutely put his foot down there. She was not marrying him. He said it was because of their age, but in reality, Poe is a poor orphan. You know, nobody wants their daughter marrying an impoverished son of actors. So you see how not being adopted is going to work against him his whole life. So in 1826, Poe heads off to the University of Virginia, which is only 7 years old. It was founded in 1819 by Thomas Jefferson. And this drawing here is actually from 1826. And you can tell by the rotunda in the middle that was built in 1826. He's a very good student, but John Allan is refusing to pony up the cash for room and board, for books. You know, it was like, I'll cover your tuition, but that's all I'm going to cover. Now, he's an extremely wealthy man, multimillionaire by our standards. But how much money do you want to invest in this poor orphan? So this is his, what we would call a dorm room. These are his quarters at the University of Virginia, which they you can still go see. So Poe gets into trouble at the University of Virginia because he just doesn't have enough money to live. So he starts gambling, thinking, well, that's how I can increase my money. But of course, gambling doesn't really ever increase your money. So he has to leave for financial reasons. He's very bitter against John Allan for this, for not providing him with a proper education. So at age 18, he leaves, he goes to Boston, and he joins the Army. And the Army pay is $5 a month, and that's for 5 years. And while he's in the Army up in Boston, he publishes Tamerlane in 1827. Tamerlane is, he said, it's called, the author is listed as a Bostonian, but it is Poe. And there were only 50 copies ever printed, and there's only 12 thought to be in existence. The last one that came up for auction was 2009. It sold for in excess of $662,000. Most of these are in museums and libraries. There was a lot of interest in these. In 1925, the Saturday Evening Post put out an article that said, you know, have you a Tamerlane in your attic? And a woman in Worcester, Mass actually did have one in her attic. So if you are out at estate sales and whatnot, if you ever see a copy of Tamerlane, regardless of its condition, pick it up. Whatever it costs, buy it. And then call me and I'll come get it. So, at this time, in 1829, Frances Allan dies. It is her dying wish that John and Eddie, as he's called, John and Eddie reconcile. And they do for a little bit, you know, to make, you know, to honor Frances. John remarries the next year in 1830 to a woman named Louisa Patterson. Edgar is not happy about this because this further, this gives John more heirs, a new wife, possibly some new children, maybe they'll even be legitimate. This pushes him farther and farther away from any inheritance he could possibly hope to get. There's a lot of bitter quarrels, and there's quarrels about money, there's quarrels about his bastard children, there's all kinds of bad feeling here. At this time, Poe decides, you know, the Army, it's not for me. I'm not doing the rest of my stint, and I'm going to pay someone to take over my term in the Army for the rest of my 5 years, which you could do, which was legal, and you could do it. But you do have to pay the person. And he'd never paid his replacement. That again, and so the replacement went right to John Allan and complained, and that just further, you know, blackened Edgar in John's estimation. So, as a last-ditch attempt to be productive and help out Edgar, John Allen pulls some strings and gets him a commission at West Point, and he enters as a cadet in July of 1830 at the age of 21. But it turns out he doesn't like West Point any more than he liked the regular army. He's there 7 months and gets court-martialed. Up until he decides to get court-martialed, he's a very, very good student. He's one of their top students, but he decides, I don't want to do this. So he stops going to class. He stops going to church. He stops going to roll call and parade, and they just kick him out, which is what he wanted. There's a lot of rumors, I'm sure some of you have heard them, that he got kicked out by showing up to class in the nude, but that's not true. That's a rumor that actually started in the 1920s when everybody was, crazy things were the norm, so he never showed up naked. He just didn't show up, period. While he's at West Point, however, some of his friends give him money to publish another book of poems, because Edgar is very, very good at making up limericks and jingles and songs, making fun of their instructors. So they think, hey, if we give him the money to publish this book of poetry, he's going to print all these funny limericks. It's going to be great. We're going to humiliate our instructors. And when the book of poetry came out, it was just romantic poetry, and his friends were disappointed. They felt they were gypped for funding this poetry book. Once he leaves West Point, he is disowned for good by John Allen. John Allen wants nothing to do with him. He's a failure, he's a flake, and he's on his own. So he travels back down to Baltimore and moves in with his aunt, Maria Poe Clem, who he calls Muddy. Now, Maria is his father, David Poe Jr.'s sister. She's the only one still alive of all his siblings, and she lives with her mother, Elizabeth, Poe's brother, William, because you remember when Eliza died, William went to live with these relatives in Baltimore, and Muddy's children, Virginia and Henry Clem. So he's 21 when he moves in. The grandmother, Elizabeth Poe, is getting a pension from the Revolutionary War. Her husband, David Poe Sr., who had immigrated from Ireland, was a Revolutionary War hero and donated a lot of his personal money toward the war effort. His wife sewed uniforms, and he is getting a pension. Well, even though he's dead, now his wife is getting it, of $240 a year, which in 2022 money is about $7,300 a year. So they all live together, all of them in this tiny little house in Baltimore. And it's just the right-hand part of the house. The rest, that what you see going off into the left, is low-income housing. Somebody had the bright idea to not tear down the Edgar Allan Poe house, but they attached low-income housing to it. So I've been to this house several times. It is tiny. It is tiny, and there's no bathroom. There's no such thing as running water. But by all accounts, they were happy there. And he decides that he's going to try a career as a writer in earnest. This is not a good time to be a writer in the United States. There's really no such thing as an American writer at this point. There's very few, and nobody can make money. You have to be born wealthy to be a writer. And because we're such a brand new country, everyone's looking to Europe and England for great literature. Nobody thinks we can produce our own. We're just always looking over our shoulder back at England and at Europe. So he is like signing up for a life of poverty, trying to make his life as a writer. In 1835, when he's 26, he gets a job as the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger, and he does a very good job. But he is fired eventually for drunkenness. Then his grandmother dies the same year, and there goes the pension. That money that whole family was counting on gone. Virginia's brother Henry dies of tuberculosis, leaving Virginia as Muddy's only child. Edgar's brother William also dies of alcoholism at the age of 24. That's a lot of alcohol to consume, to kill yourself at 24. So you can, these are rough lives these people live. You know, child mortality was very high, but everyone's mortality was pretty high. So this just leaves Mariah, Muddy, Edgar, and Edgar's daughter, Virginia. Virginia is at this point in 1835, she is 13. Edgar is 26, and they fall in love and decide to get married. Marrying your cousin is really not considered weird at this time because, again, you want to keep everything in the family. You want to keep your land, your fortune, your assets all in one family. So it's not so weird to marry your cousin. It is actually considered weird to marry a 13-year-old. So they get married secretly and then marry publicly the next year, although she falsifies her age as 21, but she would only be 14. No one's really sure if the marriage is consummated. It certainly, if it wasn't consummated right away. They were very much in love. It was a very happy marriage, and they were actually all three a very happy family. And quite frankly, when the rest of your family is pretty much dropping off like flies, you tend to cling to the ones that are left. And they were very happy, poor and happy. So that's where we are right now. It's 1835. Poe is married. He's living with his mother-in-law, also his aunt, and his child bride in Baltimore. And we're going to talk a little bit more about his literary career. And it's so massive. It's so varied. He was a writer of short stories, hoaxes, ciphers. He was a poet. He was an editor. He was a literary critic. He was a cryptographer and a defender of copyright. He wrote for numerous magazines. He often launched his own magazines. And I could throw a lot of dates at you and a lot of names. There's no quiz at the end, so I'm not going to do that. But just keep in mind, from this time, 1935, until his death in 1849, he is extremely prolific. And you're talking about someone who had no heat in their house, who had no electricity, wrote everything by candlelight. It's amazing what he could accomplish, what any of them could accomplish, really, under those circumstances. So just to talk a little bit about what he writes, he is the creator of the short story, which Poe says a short story must be this. It must have a complete action. It must occur in one place and one time. These rules didn't exist before. He made them exist. They move around a lot at this time. They live in Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York. This is where they lived in Philadelphia, and this house would be rented, and everywhere he ever lived would be rented. These are not wealthy people, and home ownership is certainly beyond their means. So they move around all the time. He's writing all the time. He gets jobs for various magazines as an editor. And as a critic, and he is a fierce critic. He is brutal, and that does not make him a lot of friends. He is very high-minded and thinks very well of himself, and not making a lot of friends, and he's not making a lot of money. And I show this house in Philadelphia because in 1842, he tried very hard to get an interview for a job in the Philadelphia Custom House. and he missed the interview because he was sick, probably, maybe hungover, maybe drunk. So life is very hard, but he just keeps writing day and night. In 1838, he publishes his only novel, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. Arthur Gordon Pym sounds a lot like Edgar Allan Poe. This is a crazy tale of taking a ship down to the Antarctic, which no one obviously had done and won't do for a very long time after this is published. So he has no idea what the Antarctic looks like. And it's crazy. It's full of cannibalism and sinking ships and wild adventures, mutiny. Turns out the ocean in the Antarctic is white. The water is white and the temperature is hot. Is amazing. I mean, and this inspired so many science fiction writers because no one was really doing anything like this. Jules Verne was very influenced by Poe's Tales of the Fantastic. He invented the mystery story. There was no such thing as mystery fiction until Poe decided to invent mystery fiction. And his hero was C. Auguste Dupin. He was a French character. And he wrote 3 short stories about Dupin that Arthur Conan Doyle, who is the author of all the Sherlock Holmes books, gives full credit to Poe. He said there would be no Sherlock Holmes if there was no Dupin. He literally invented the genre. And that's why the Mystery Writers of America, their annual award for excellence is called the Edgars in his honor. So my favorite Dupin story is The Mystery of Marie Roget. And it's about a French girl who gets murdered and is floating down the Seine in Paris when they find her. And this was based on a true story of a girl named Mary Rogers who lived in Manhattan and was found floating in the Hudson. And the real story there is that this is Hoboken, across the river from New York City at about in the 1820s, 1830s. Hoboken had developed into like a real pleasure spot. So people from New York City would sail across the Hudson and spend the day in Hoboken, and there would be taverns and river walks. As many as 20,000 people a day would go over in the summer, all kinds of fun things to do to get out of the city on a hot summer day. But of course, like everything in the United States, it's got a sleazy underbelly. And Mary Rogers, it's also a great place to get an illegal abortion. So Mary Rogers, pregnant by one of her boyfriends, goes to Hoboken. Her lover takes her to Hoboken to make her get the abortion, and she dies and is flung into the river. And that's that. So, but this is what Hoboken looks like at the time. And if you look across the river, that's what Manhattan looks like. So it's just fascinating to think of where we live now, 200 years ago. In 1842, Edgar Allan Poe meets Charles Dickens. This is not a real representation. This is actually a figurine that you can buy and put in your Charles Dickens Christmas village. It's the closest thing I could find. They are mutual admirers of each other. Poe is he's much better regarded in Europe than he is in the United States at this time. They meet in Philadelphia, and they discuss a big problem, which is copyright infringement and intellectual property theft. So magazine editors in England think nothing of stealing American writers and putting their works in their magazines and not giving anybody any money. In the United States, we're doing the same thing. We're stealing European stories and putting them in our magazines and not giving anyone credit and not giving anyone compensation. Look, you're 2 months away by boat. What are you going to do? So this was a big problem for Dickens and Poe, and they got together to discuss it. don't know, that much really came of it, but they were both big champions of rights of authors, which is something you don't hear about with Poe. You just hear that he's a madman, but he actually was far from it. So looking at our figurine for your Christmas Village, why is Dickens holding the raven? Well, Poe very much admired a book by Dickens called Barnaby Rudge. And in Barnaby Rudge, there is a talking raven named Grip. And Poe borrowed that idea for his epic, very famous classic poem, The Raven. So this is a children's book called A Raven Named Grip, that you might want to read. Don't be ashamed to read children's books. I read them all the time. So back to Rufus Griswold. Poe is a critic of other people's work, other people's poetry especially. And again, he's very brutal. Rufus Griswold is also a poet and also a critic as well. And they clash constantly. Griswold is from a well-to-do family. He's a failed minister. And at one point he took over a job. Poe got fired as an editor for a magazine. Griswold took over that job for more money. So there's a lot of contention. They just hate each other. They play nice when they have to, when they need something from each other, but they loathe each other. So in 1842, Griswold publishes an anthology of American poets. He includes Poe, but also asks Poe to write a criticism for it. And he pays him to write it. So he's expecting a really nice, glowing critique of his book of poetry, but he doesn't get that. Poe hated the book, thinks Griswold's a hack with a silver spoon in his mouth. He doesn't say that in his critique. He tries to be fair, but it's very mediocre. It's not the glowing review Griswold wanted, and Griswold just hates him that much more. To add insult to injury, the next year, Poe starts to do a lecture tour called Poets and Poetry of America, which was the title of Griswold's book. And Poe goes around in his lecture tour bad-mouthing Griswold and also bad-mouthing the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow for good measure. So Poe has a very high opinion of himself and his abilities. Poe also invented cryptography. This happened when he was working for a magazine called Alexander's Weekly Messenger. And if you like crossword puzzles in your newspaper or any other kind of fun brain teaser puzzle, that's because you can thank Edgar Allan Poe, because he invented that as well. So he was working for Alexander's Weekly Messenger, and he wrote into he said to his readers, write in and send me any kind of cipher or puzzle that you can, and I will crack it. I will crack any code you send me. And he did. And he would publish these in the paper. And they were so popular that they remained they're still in newspapers today. So he wrote a short story called The Gold Bug. And it was so, a little boy in the early 1900s named William Friedman was so impressed with the gold bug that he dedicated his life to cryptography. And he became the #1 code cracker in World War II for the Japanese code machine Purple. Because of Friedman, the United States was able to crack the Japanese codes. And all because of Poe, all because of being so intrigued by the gold bug and the concept of cryptography. So Edgar Allan Poe helps win World War II. Thank you, Edgar. And does anyone really know that or care? So in 1844, the whole Poe family, Muddy, Virginia, and Edgar, or Eddie as they call him, moved to New York City. And he's going to launch his own magazine called the Broadway Journal. And this is exactly what Broadway looks like at that time. So while they're living in New York City and he's working on his magazine, he publishes The Raven in 1845. The Raven was not a stroke of luck. A Raven was a carefully crafted poem that he wrote to be a hit. It was a hit single and he knew it going in. So he's only paid $9 for the publication of The Raven, which in 2022 is $330, which even in our money is not very good. But the bonus here is he's now famous. This is like a smash. The Raven is all anyone can talk about. And he becomes famous and starts or continues his lecture tour. And now his lecture tour is very much sought after because he'll read The Raven if he comes to your town. So with fame, naturally, comes women. So his truth is stranger than fiction. I could spend 2 hours talking to you about all of Poe's girlfriends, their husbands, the scandal, the backbiting, everything, the suicide attempts. It's so convoluted and so beyond weird, but I'll do my best to kind of outline what's going on with him. But remember, he's traveling up and down the coast, and he's got a woman in virtually every city. So this is Sarah Helen Whitman. She's a wealthy widow. They're the best kind. She's from Providence, Rhode Island. She's childless. She's a poet, an essayist. She's also a spiritualist and has an interest in the occult. So she and Poe become good friends, but he's still married to Virginia, who is at home in New York with her mother while he tours around. This is Frances Osgood, married but separated. She asked to meet Poe when he praised her poetry very highly in a review. She actually was a very good poet, and you can purchase anthologies of her poetry to this day. So they meet, they have an infatuation or whatever, and they begin a romantic letter writing campaign to each other. They publish poems about each other, thinking that nobody knows that they're publishing these love poems about each other, but everyone knows. The literary circles in America are very small, very tight. Everyone knows everybody. They're both married, but they're in love. Oh, and there's a further problem. Rufus Griswold is also in love with Frances Osgood. So now they're competing, and he's married, and they're competing for the attention of Frances. There's a big scandal. Another woman who likes Poe, and I know it's getting really crazy now, Elizabeth Elliot, starts sending Virginia letters and anonymous letters that your husband's carrying on with Frances Osgood. There's all of this, challenging of duels and threats and poison letters. It's beyond crazy. I can't even explain it well without really confusing you, but it is wild. She also has 2 daughters and gets pregnant with her 3rd daughter. Now she's separated from her husband. So who's the dad? We don't know. The baby is born in 1846. Her name is Fanny Fay. She dies 4 months later. Upset that his wife is embroiled in such a horrible scandal, Frances Osgood's husband, returns to her, and they carry on. Fanny Fay dies at 4 months old because a lot of children didn't live. And the scandal costs everyone their good reputation. Poe, Frances Osgood, they lose a lot of literary friends, and they never see each other again after 1847. Interestingly, this portrait on the left, the oval portrait, was painted, that's Poe, painted by Samuel Osgood, who was Frances's husband. He was a painter. And the one on the left is just an interesting side story. This was painted around 1843. ended up in somebody's private collection in Charlottesville, Virginia. When that person died, a man bought it for a few dollars at an estate sale in 1879. I'm sorry, 1979. It was auctioned in 2010 and there were no bidders. Unbelievable. There were only 3 paintings of Poe ever done, and it's these 2. The third one is lost forever, unless you find it at an estate sale. Just to show you how hard life is, here's a few daguerreotypes of Poe taken a few years before his death. I had one woman ask me at another lecture, if he looks like that, why does he have so many girlfriends? And it's all relative, isn't it? I mean, people did not have running water. They did not have what we consider like shampoo that we would use was not even invented till the 20th century. You know, everybody looked like that, more or less. So he didn't look in any way odd or strange, although you can see that life is really knocking him down a little bit. So 1846, 3 years before Poe dies, the Broadway Journal, Poe's magazine that he launched in New York, fails. And Poe, his wife Virginia, and his mother-in-law, Aunt Mariah, moved to the Bronx. This is the Bronx, which at the time was the country. They rent a friend's summer cottage for $100 a year, which is about $3,600. It's not insulated. It's not in any way suitable for winter living. It's a terrible place. And that's where they live because that's where they can afford. Virginia gets very, very sick. She has TB, same disease that killed his mother, killed her brother. She starts coughing up blood, and they're so poor that they don't even have a blanket. And Virginia is covered with his coat, his army coat, left over from when he joined the army. So life is very hard for them. And Virginia dies of tuberculosis on January 30th, 1847, at the age of 24, the same age as their mother, as Edgar's mother, and the same age as Edgar's brother. And she gets buried in Fordham Cemetery in the Bronx, no headstone. So he resumes his poetry and Poets and Poetry of America tour. He leaves his mother-in-law in the Bronx, and he meets Nancy Richmond in Lowell, Massachusetts on the tour. Got to hurry up, Jose?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. He nicknames her Annie, but she's married. They fall deeply in love, but what can you do? She's married, and he writes in a letter to a friend, do not ever speak to me of Annie again until you can tell me her husband is dead. But her husband doesn't die till well after Poe. But when her husband does die, she legally changes her first name to Annie, and that's what's on her tombstone. Then, you remember her? The woman from Providence, Rhode Island, the rich widow? Suddenly they're engaged. That's lucky. So for Poe. So they're gonna get engaged. They're gonna get married in December of 1848, until her mother breaks it to her that you shouldn't be marrying him. He didn't quit alcohol. He does drink, by the way. He's not a drug addict and he's not mentally ill, but he does drink a little bit too much, and he didn't have a good constitution for it. It did not enhance his personality. Anyway, he promised Sarah Helen Whitman that he would stop drinking, and he didn't. And his mother said, besides the fact that he didn't stop drinking, he's also engaged to her. Remember her? Poe's childhood sweetheart. She's now a wealthy widow, the best kind. She's living in Richmond in this house. Nice house for the time. He meets her on the lecture tour. Actually, he shows up at her house unannounced. They get engaged. It's like they were never apart. She inherited about $100,000 from her wealthy husband. He made his fortune running boats up and down the James River in Richmond. But the will stipulates she'll lose 75 percent of that if she ever remarries. But they get engaged anyway. But he's still engaged to Sarah Helen Whitman up in Providence. But that's okay, because Providence and Richmond are really far away and nobody has to know, except it does come out. So she breaks their engagement. That's okay. He's got another rich widow, and her children don't approve and her brothers don't approve. But they get married anyway. I mean, sorry, they do not get married. They get engaged anyway and are planning to marry. So that's her very nice home. So at this point, Mariah's in the Bronx, and he's going to launch a new magazine called Stylus, Poe is. So he's traveling around up and down the coast, collecting funds to launch this magazine. He has decided he's going to bring his mother-in-law to Richmond. He's going to marry Sarah Elmira and live in Richmond with her. So on his way, collecting money for his magazine, going to get his mother-in-law, his first stop is Baltimore. He takes the boat from Richmond to Baltimore at the end of September. He visits Elmira the night before, and she is very concerned because he's very, very sick. She doesn't like the looks of him, and she says she was up all night worrying about him. He gets to Baltimore, sorry guys, and dies on October 7th, 1849, under mysterious circumstances. So on October 3rd, he's found outside a tavern, very, very sick. Many people thought he was drunk. In those days, but he wasn't. In those days, though, taverns were doubled as polling centers, as voting centers. So they did double duty. You could have a few drinks and then vote. And he was found outside a tavern in weird clothes, not his own clothes. They were ill-fitting, they were dirty, they were ragged and soiled. He was wearing a straw hat that had the brim broken off of it. He was a mess. He had no tie. So he's brought to the hospital. He's semi-conscious for quite a while, a few days. He seems to call out Reynolds. Nobody knows who or what Reynolds is. He calls it out a lot. And then he dies on October 7th, 1849. What did Poe die of? Take your pick. Was he murdered? Was it alcohol, bad heart, rabies, syphilis, brain hemorrhage? I mean, you name it. It could have been any or all of these things. Nobody really knows. It's truly a mystery. And one of the theory is that he was cooped. And cooping is a favorite theory of a lot of people. Because it was election day, political gangs who were very vicious would kidnap people off the street and keep them in coops and ply them with liquor and beat them and change their clothes and drag them all over the city of Baltimore and all cities to vote over and over and over for their candidate. It was a very vicious practice. And because Poe was found in not his own clothes outside of a tavern, this is a popular theory. Another theory was that he was murdered by Sarah Elmira's brothers, beaten to death. He certainly looked beaten. You know, was he binging alcohol? He probably did have a bad heart or brain lesions, because just of the way healthcare was. Rabies, syphilis, all of these things are posed. We don't know. So Rufus Griswold, our friend, at the day of the funeral, writes an obituary for the New York Tribune under the name of Ludwig. That's his pseudonym. And he writes, Edgar Allan Poe is dead. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved. He's afraid of the backlash, but everyone knows it's him anyway. Unfortunately, newspapers around the country pick up this obituary. And it's a very poison obituary. It's nasty and full of libel. And it just goes in every newspaper in the country. Afterward, he cons his mother-in-law into giving him all of Poe's manuscripts, and he publishes them in an anthology and then keeps the manuscripts. First of all, they were not Mariah's to give away because Rosalie, his sister, is his next of kin. And the foreword of the anthology says that all money raised here will go to take care of Poe's mother-in-law, but of course she never sees a penny. Instead, he gives her 6 copies of the anthologies and says, sell them for what you can get for them, and that's it. So when he puts out a further collection, he takes away the introduction that says this is for her benefit and puts in his obituary of Poe. So it is just, and a biographical sketch that is just nasty, backbiting, and really, really does damage to Poe's reputation. And Poe is not friendless. His friends speak out that this is wrong, but it's what people want to read. They want to believe the worst in him. It's salacious. It's, sensational, and they eat it up. In his bio, he puts that he's a drunk, he's a drug addict, that he was expelled from the University of Virginia when all he did was leave, that he blackmailed women, that he deserted from the army when he did not desert. He praised his work to make him seem fair, but then just completely wrote this poison biography. So future biographers did defend him, but still today in 2022, there are people who just want to believe the worst, and the damage was done. And I went to a Poe event several years ago in Baltimore where actors were portraying Poe and his mother, and H.P. Lovecraft was there to talk about how Poe influenced the sci-fi genre. And there was an actor playing Rufus Griswold, and he was literally booed off the stage. And he would talk more loudly and more indignantly, and the more he did, the more he was booed off the stage. So anyone who knows anything about Poe knows about Rufus Griswold and what a bad character he was. So Poe, since he died in Baltimore, and by the way, you were buried where you died in those days. You weren't shipped around to be buried with your loved ones. You simply were buried where you dropped. But he was in Baltimore, and his family, because remember his grandparents lived in Baltimore, had a family plot at Westminster Presbyterian Church. He was put in an unmarked grave, and he never had a stone. This was put up in 1875. Stones are for wealthy people. However, in 1875, people raised money. They were starting to realize, especially with a new biography that came out that was very fair to Poe, that we have a literary treasure buried here in Baltimore, and we have no way to commemorate him. So they put this up, then removed the bones and put them under here in another corner of the cemetery. And so this was dedicated in November of 1875. Wrong way. And here's another picture of it. People often leave flowers, and it's a big tourist attraction. You can see that all the literature behind it, the info podiums. On January 19th of 1885, Poe's 76th birthday, they laid Virginia and Mariah there as well. Virginia, no, you can't make this up. The Fordham graveyard was being reclaimed and being destroyed, made into something else. So Poe's biographer, William Gill, took Virginia's bones and put them in a box and put them under his bed. And there they stayed for an undetermined amount of time until she could be interred here. It is beyond weird. But again, this is the 19th century. They didn't think like we did. Under your bed is as good a place as any, I suppose. So now, Mariah's there, so you can see their names on each side. Poe is on 2 sides. Virginia's on one side. Mariah's on the other. And it's very sweet. I've been there many times. I recommend visiting it. They were a very happy, devoted family. And it's nice that they can be together with a headstone all together at the end. So what happened to Rosalie? We know Poe's brother died young. His sister died at the age of 63. They had a love-hate relationship. He didn't really like her very much. She alternately, they didn't know each other very well. She was proud of Poe, but would think nothing of also saying bad things about him in public as the mood struck her, which he didn't appreciate. So she lived a fairly comfortable life with the Mackenzies, again, not known if they were good to her or treated her like the poor orphan she was. But when the Civil War came along, they were Southerners. They lost everything. Their home was destroyed. They lost their fortune. Her foster mother died in 1865, and her foster brother lost somehow her $2,000 inheritance that Joseph Gallego left her. So she's very poor. She makes her way to Baltimore, but the Baltimore Poes reject her after a while. They didn't like her very much, and she was left to wander the streets as a destitute beggar. She would forge signatures, Edgar Allan Poe signatures, and sell them for money. She would also sell little artifacts that she found and tell them that they were Edgar Allan Poe's personal effects to make some money. She dies in a charity home in Washington, D.C. and in 1874 at the age of 63. So a very sad life for her. The other women in Poe's life, his romantic interests, Sarah Elmira Royster also lived a long time. She lived in her 70s, which was a long time. And so you could see these three pictures of teenager, middle-aged, and elderly. Both Annie Richmond and Sarah Helen Whitman also lived to their 70s and cooperated with a reputable biographer in the 1870s. Talk a little bit about the Poe Toaster. I'm going way over time and I apologize. Poe Toaster was a person who left a half a bottle of cognac and 4 roses every year on Poe's birthday in the middle of the night. This was recorded as happening as early as the 1940s, officially recorded, but it probably actually started in the 1920s. And it was inherited from father to son. We don't know anything about who this person was or why. It got in the 70s, the curator of the Poe Museum in Baltimore set up a vigil in the church window, in Westminster church window, to watch the person. Didn't bother this person, just surveyed him every year and developed a little signal so that between each other so that they knew he was the real Poe Toaster. In 1990, this photo up in the left is a Life magazine photographer took that photo with infrared. And that spurred a lot of interest in who this Poe Toaster was. So much so that in 2009, some, I don't know what you would call them, hooligans, ruffians, decided to attack the Poe Toaster and find out who he really was. Poe Toaster didn't like that, got away, but that was the last time the Poe Toaster ever showed up. So the theory was, A, I'm done with this, B, they died, or C, it was the 200th anniversary of Poe's birth, we're ending this now. So he didn't come back in 2010. In 2011, 4 imposters showed up. And we know they were imposters because they didn't lay the roses the right way. And they didn't give the signal to the curator. 2012, the Poe Museum says this tradition's dead. It's dead. We're done. We're not staying up in the middle of the night looking for anybody anymore. But in 2016, the Maryland Historical Society revived the tradition with an actor. One has to ask why. So, real quick, Poe and popular culture. Baltimore Ravens. They're absolutely named after Poe. Check out the color scheme. Check out the mascot. His name is Poe. That's a comic book somebody gave me based on the Black Heart, the Black Cat. And it's got a whole bunch, House of Ushers in there. The Beatles put Poe on the cover of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in '67.
Oh,
They
God.
also sang about him in I Am the Walrus in '67, which was the Magical Mystery Tour, different album. Here he is on South Park. Here he is on The Simpsons. Jose, do we have sound? If I play this? video?
Yes, if you unmute everybody, yeah,
Well, can they hear this?
yeah.
Okay.
Don't I crispy, short, and shaven, thou?
I said,
But you're no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's plutonian shore.
quoth the raven.
Eat my shorts. All right, stop it. He says nevermore, and that's all he'll ever say. Okay.
Don't I crisp?
Could you hear? You could hear that? Okay.
Products you can only imagine.
Century stain remover. Let's meet the inventor, Dr. Nick Riviera.
Thank you, Troy. Hi, everybody. Troy, I brought with me the gravestone of author and troubled soul Edgar Allan Poe.
One of our best writers.
Yes, but unfortunately, a century of neglect has turned this tombstone into a depressing eyesore.
So what? I guess we're gonna have to throw it away.
Not so fast, Troy. With one application of Spiffy, you'll think the body's still warm.
Quoth the raven, what a shine.
Ooh, that's one clean tombstone. Products you can only imagine.
Okay. Some representation in the movies from left to right is a 1970 movie called Gas, where a poison gas kills everyone over the age of 25. So the hippies take over, and you see Poe on his motorcycle coming down to visit the hippies on the commune to say, hey, just stay cool. Moving along, that's John Cusack in 2012 in The Raven, Klaus Kinski in Web of the Spider, 1971, Silvano Tranquilli in Danza Macabra, which from 1964, which in this country was called Castle of Blood, Barry O'More in 1909, and Ben Chaplin in the movie Twixt, which is a really weird movie from Francis Ford Coppola that I really like, and I don't know why. I love this movie, The Loves of Edgar Allan Poe, 1942, only about an hour long. It's got Linda Darnell as Virginia, his wife, and Shepard Strudwick, who would later change his name to John Shepard, playing Poe. What I love about this movie is it shows Poe as a hardworking author and not some crazy person, because even the biographies they make today still buy into that whole, macabre existence that simply didn't exist. They show him as poor, as fighting with his stepfather, as juggling his loves, and working really hard. And they deals a lot with his fights for copyright. It whitewashes him a lot, not totally historically accurate, but I love this movie. So if you want to read further, this is a good biography of Poe by Kenneth Silverman, excuse me. It's a kind of long, but it's worth the read. Then of course we have this book about Eliza Poe, and there's no shortage. You can buy anthologies of Francis Osgood's poetry. There's no shortage of good books and bad books about Poe. Please visit the museums and if you can, any and all of these museums, they're all really good, fun. And I thank you very much. Did everyone stay or did they?
No.
We're still here. Thank you, Ava.
Thanks, thank you.
That was very nice.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Really interesting.
Thank you so much.
We certainly know a lot about Poe.
Oh, she's on right there.
Thank you.
Questions? There's everybody.
Yeah, sounds like a good program for the 19th century organization, the Victorian Society.
I thought the Victorian Society is defunct, Adriana.
Is what?
Out of business.
No. We had a meeting last month. We had to cancel this week's because of the weather. We have a full schedule coming up.
I did present for the Victorian Society on Poe already,
Our local chapter or the national group?
the local chapter about a decade ago.
Well, nobody would remember it. You can do it again.
Oh, that's nice to know.
Could revive the interest in it again. That was a fascinating story.
Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Wonderful.
Great job, Ava.
Thanks. Thank you.
We love you, Ava.
That's nice. Thank you. Who said that?
Me.
Okay. So no questions at all. Anything in the
questions,
chat,
Tom?
Jose?
Let me think.
Let me see. There's a lot of questions in the chat. Well done, very interesting, excellent.
Someone wanted to know if Poe was influenced by any literary persons.
Yes, you're right.
Did you hear that, Ava?
Yeah, yes. Well, as we said, Dickens for sure.
Right.
All the romantic poets, and particularly the dark romantic poets. So the dark romantics, so the romantic poets came out of the 18th century. They really disliked the age of reason and the industrial age. They believed that science robbed the beauty from nature.
Right.
And then you had your more dark romantics who were like Lord Byron and Mary Shelley, who he very much admired. And so he considered himself a dark romantic as well. And they did tend to be a little more mysterious. So, they weren't writing poems to butterflies. They were writing poems to, the decaying corpse of my beloved cat. But they still saw that beauty in nature. So, and in turn, Poe was very influential on the French poet Charles Baudelaire, who wrote Flowers of Evil. And but he was not really influenced by any American writers because there really weren't any that were not Age of Reason. And he really was not a fan of Age of Reason writers.
Okay.
Ava, I have a question here.
Yep.
It states, I'm not familiar with all of Poe's work. Did he ever work his past as a foster child into any of his stories by having a character have that same background?
Well, sure. Arthur Gordon Pym is an orphan. And when he embarks on that weird journey to the Antarctic, and definitely his childhood is all over the place. I mean, he invented, among other things, modern psychology, because his was the first literature to ever examine the mental state and the mental state's effect on your emotions and your behaviors. The theories of this, not the theories, but the feelings of guilt and shame. And he incorporated that all the time, and always incorporating a beautiful woman dying. Now, he would have been a little boy, there's no childcare. So he and his brother are hanging out at the theater every night. And he would have watched his mother, who played Ophelia, who played Juliet. He would have watched her die over and over and over every night on stage. And then she actually died surrounded by her children. So he saw his mother actually die at the age of 3. And all of this comes in you see this in his literature over and over again. The death of the beautiful young woman, the grief, the mourning. And then, his wife died at 24. Everyone he loves dies very young. And that's really evident in all of his writing.
Another question, was he influenced by any other puzzle masters?
No. He invented it.
Yes, he did, didn't he?
What we do now, crossword puzzles and word searches, that's all him. He just liked to do it. He thought it was fun. He wanted to challenge himself and other people. And he took great pride in the fact that he could crack anybody's code.
Okay.
Wow. Well, any other questions, anybody?
I don't think so.
All right then, Ava, I want to thank you again. You did a marvelous job.
Thank you. Well, thanks for showing up, everybody. It was a lot
Really,
of fun.
really.
Ava.
And if.
Good job,
if people
Ava.
want- Yeah, and if people want to watch the program again, it'll be on our YouTube page.
Support your
Enjoy.
local library.
Yes, please.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ava.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So,
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
How do I, here we go.
Oh, there's so many. Look at that.
Big Chuck was in here too,
Oh, he was?
but now it is Ken.
Oh, what?